Hello and welcome to all of you joining us. I'm Cheryl Bundy, the Director of Spiritual Care at Silver Hill Hospital, and today I have the pleasure of hosting Grand Rounds for Dr. Katzman. We are so privileged to welcome Dr. Anna Yusum, presenting on the topic Uncanny Coincidences and Telepathic Dreams on the use of spirituality, intuition, and synchronicity in clinical setting. I will have the pleasure of introducing her in a moment. A little housekeeping to start. Our next Grand Rounds is on March 13th with Dr. Mauricio Toen presenting on the topic of bipolar disorder comorbid conditions. We hope you can join us for that as well. Back to today's lecture. Your questions remain an important part of our Grand Rounds. I will moderate a Q&A discussion with Dr. Yusum at the end of her lecture. This is a great opportunity to put forward questions and comments to Dr. Yusum, which you can submit anytime during the lecture by using the Q&A box. If you wish to receive CME or CEU credits, please complete the evaluation survey that will automatically show up in your browser when we end the webinar. We will also send a copy of the survey to today's participants. And finally, disclosures. No planners of this activity have indicated a relevant financial relationship with ACCME defined and eligible companies whose primary business is producing, marketing, selling, reselling, or distributing healthcare products used by and on patients. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Anna Yusum. Dr. Yusum is a clinical assistant professor at Yale Medical School, who, along with Dr. Christopher Pittenger, is presently creating a new spirituality and mental health center at Yale, which will be a bridge between Yale Medical School and Yale Divinity School. As an internationally recognized, award-winning, board-certified, Stanford and Yale-educated psychiatrist and executive coach, Dr. Yusum is the best-selling author of Fulfilled: How the Science of Spirituality Can Help You Live a Happier, More Meaningful Life. With clients including Forbes 500 CEOs, Olympic athletes, A-list actors and actresses, and the chairs of academic departments at top universities, Dr. Anna Yusum has helped over 3,000 people achieve greater impact, purpose, and joy in their life and work. I will now pass the presentation over to Dr. Yusum. Anna, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody today. I would like to speak to you today about the intersection of mental health and spirituality. And as Cheryl mentioned, I, together with Dr. Pittenger, am starting a mental health and spirituality center at Yale. Many, many years ago in the world of psychiatry, something like that never would have happened. Sigmund Freud, the eminent founder of psychoanalysis, believed religion to be an obsessional universal neuroses. And now religion and spirituality have been shown with a sufficient evidence base, which I'm going to cover today, to greatly reduce, in certain cases, mental and physical health conditions while increasing mental and physical well-being. So we're going to launch into the talk. I have no disclosures. The educational objectives of today are: number one, to describe the clinical application of spirituality, intuition, and synchronicity in psychiatry and mental health treatment. Number two, to discuss how intuition operates at various levels of awareness and influences therapeutic dynamics. And number three, to understand spiritually informed complexities within the therapeutic context, from unconscious communication and thought transference to the potential pitfalls of toxic spirituality, psychic addiction, and religious OCD. So for our agenda, we have a few items, and we're gonna go through first that spirituality and religion may reduce mental and physical illness and all the scientific evidence for that. Second, that spirituality and religion may also increase mental and physical well-being. So I just want to talk about these 2 points first. I am a psychiatrist and an executive coach. As a psychiatrist, I help individuals with a certain symptomology to restore baseline function. So we're going from below baseline to baseline. But in addition to that, as an executive coach, I help people who are already quite high functioning function even better, so optimizing their performance. And for spirituality and religion, it has been shown there is data for both, that you could restore functionality and symptomology if there is already mental health diagnoses, and for individuals without diagnoses, that there is enhancement in well-being. Number 3 on the agenda item, I'm going to talk about how intuition is a very powerful bridge between science and spirituality. I'm going to then speak about the 3 types of intuition with some case examples of each. I'm going to talk about synchronicity as a psychodynamic construct and how it came into the world of psychiatry through Carl Jung. And I'm going to present several examples and cases of synchronicity from my own practice. And then I'm going to go speak about toxic spirituality and some potentially destructive New Age beliefs that some of your clients may come to you with, and ultimately discuss how to integrate the positive aspects of spirituality and religion into your clinical practice. So in our country, 90%, 93% of the population believes in God or a higher power, according to the Gallup polls. The words "In God We Trust" appear on every bill and coin produced by the US Mint. So spirituality is ubiquitous. And what is spirituality? First, my favorite definition of spirituality comes from British professor of religion and theology, Christopher Cook. And that definition is that spirituality is a universal dimension of the human experience. It could be intimately inner, immanent, and personal, but it can also be wholly transcendent and beyond the self. Whatever it is, it's often experienced as being of fundamental importance and concerned with purpose in life, truth, and values. Now, spirituality is a deep well upon which many people draw in times of crisis, unrest, personal challenge. It reinforces inner peace and provides a sense of connection to a force greater than themselves. That's the positive benefits. Spirituality also has some difficult aspects, which we'll describe later. But when used in the more positive way, it can relieve stress of everyday life, especially when directed with intentional practice. Research shows that spirituality can benefit both the mind and the body. Whether someone's coping with cancer, addiction, or depression, spiritual exercises help them increase acceptance, decrease negative emotions, find meaning, and deepen their relationships. Spirituality can also help address issues like poor self-esteem, low confidence, lack of self-control, and fear of daily tasks and challenges. For this reason, it could be a healthy extension to mental health treatment, and it can also simply be a way to stay mentally strong and healthy. So let's first discuss the difference between religion and spirituality. So religion often refers to participation in or endorsement of practices, beliefs, attitudes, or sentiments associated with an organized community of faith. Spirituality, in contrast, refers to connecting to something greater than oneself, which can be either religious or secular. Examples of secular spirituality include meditation, journaling, yoga, breathwork, spending time in nature, engaging in creative pursuits, among other things. The way in which spirituality manifests among the world's many cultures is quite diverse, reflecting many aspects of people's lives and surroundings, their religious upbringing, their choices, their geographic location, their culture, and the way their mind works. So when we think about religion versus spirituality, there is 4 primary categories. There is the individuals who are both religious and spiritual. Then there's the neither religious nor spiritual. Then there's the spiritual but not religious. And then there's the religious but, neither spiritual nor religious, religious and spiritual but not religious, and religious but not spiritual. So the 4 categories, right? So this shows how those 4 categories have been changing over time. And we see that the categories that have been going down have been the religious category and the neither spiritual nor religious category. And the categories that have been going up over time have been the spiritual but not religious and the neither spiritual. What's been going down is actually both, as well as the religious. And then what has been going up is the spiritual but not religious, and neither spiritual nor religious. So what that basically shows here is that spirituality without religion is the thing that is increasing the most in our culture. And let me give you an example of what somebody who is spiritual but not religious can look like. This is somebody who, for instance, will go to their yoga practice and then maybe go light some Shabbat candles. And the next day will attend communion with a friend. And then the next day will engage in some breath work and go to a cacao ceremony, maybe have a psychedelic retreat in a month or two, connecting to all sorts of different secular practices from a lot of different cultures, but not necessarily having one organized faith tradition of which they're a part. And this is a very interesting group, the spiritual but not religious group, because not only do they consider themselves spiritual but not religious, this group also often shares a number of values. These are the people who generally don't want the rainforest cut down. These are people who tend to be more liberal in their perspective. So this is almost a cultural zeitgeist that this spiritual but not religious group is increasing. And what it lacks, in contrast to traditional religion, is the community element that many religions offer. And so a lot of people are creating communities around the spiritual but not religious groups. So according to the Pew Research Trust, 7 in 10 US adults describe themselves as spiritual in some way, including 22% who are spiritual but not religious. So this is from 2023. And according to these studies, 83% of all US adults believe people to have a soul or a spirit in addition to their physical body. 81% say there's something spiritual beyond the natural world, even if you can't see it. 74% say they have some things that science can't possibly explain. 45% say they've had a sudden feeling of connection when something is beyond this world. 38% say they have a strong feeling that somebody who has passed away was communicating with them at some point. 30% say that they've had personal encounters with spirits of people who've passed. So this is a lot of people in our country having these beliefs. Now, when we think about spirituality, it's this idea of an amorphous, transcendent, possibly immanent, internal, subjective experience. But what does it really mean? I wanted to bring up the ideas of a friend of mine, Jonathan Ellerby, who's a professor of comparative religion in British Columbia. He wrote this book, recently came out, on the 7 types of spiritual experiences. So when people say that they're having a spiritual experience, often it will fall into one of these 7 categories. The first category is an experience of truth and beauty. These are often the transcendent feelings we have, acknowledged via mindful or sensory presence. Then there's the experiences of ordinary magic. And this is synchronicity, which we're going to talk about. This is miracles. I define a miracle as something highly beneficial yet statistically improbable, or magic that happens. People experience these sorts of things. Number 3 is encounters with the spirit world. This is encounters with immaterial beings to which we can relate anthropomorphically, like ghosts, deceased loved ones, gurus. Number 4 is an experience of the divine or subtle energy, feeling as though you've had a communication with God, feeling you've had some sort of energetic encounter, something that is unusual or outside of your everyday life. Number 5 is experiences of the cosmic self. So this is like a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience. This is when somebody's undergoing a trauma and they're floating above the room in the emergency room looking down at their body. Number 6 is experiences of the formless spirit. And this is of ultimate or supreme reality, where you see all things as one, like the Buddhists describe, but there's still a subject-object quality to this experience. We are a part of this, but it's right at the end of the self, right at the edge of that self. And this is in contrast to number 7, which is the experience of pure consciousness. This is enlightenment, samadhi, satori. This is the undifferentiated unity of everything, where even the observer dissolves. So this is a loss of time, space, and self. You're fully absorbed into one consciousness, and even awareness disintegrates. So how does spirituality come into play within mental health and psychiatry? So in much of medicine, there is a long-standing divergence between science and spirituality. Sigmund Freud, as I mentioned before, described belief in God as delusional. and religion as an obsessional universal neuroses. Although Freud wrote about the oceanic feeling, the unspeakable wholeness, limitlessness, and awesome feeling when one becomes aware of a connection to something greater than oneself, he admitted to never having experienced this personally. In contrast, Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung acknowledged the spiritual connection as a central core of human experience. Jung believed that life has a spiritual purpose beyond material goals, which entails discovering and fulfilling our deep innate potential. Jung believed that we are born whole and lose this sense of wholeness as we go through life. Connecting to this unity and our own transcendent nature was, for Jung, the way of restoring our inherent wholeness. Albert Einstein may have best reconciled Freud and Jung's opposing views in saying that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. Science is always searching for that which is objectively measurable, transcendent, subjective, and therefore difficult to measure and reproduce. It is not surprising, therefore, that spirituality means different things to different people. Einstein's words are telling, and Einstein's words are, in a way, resonating here where we are trying to come up with a scientific evidence base to be able to better quantify those things that are very difficult to quantify. So studies have shown over time that spirituality improves physical health, mental health, and subjective well-being while reducing addictions, psychological distress, and suicidal behavior. In cancer patients, spirituality was associated with less distress and better quality of life, regardless of how threatening the cancer was. Individuals attending church weekly were less likely to be hospitalized for any reason and spent less time as inpatients than those who went to church less frequently. Religious and spiritual commitment was associated with reduced depression in the elderly, quicker recovery, reduced worry and fear, and less alcohol dependence. In a study of almost 700 adults with alcoholism, a spiritual awakening was the strongest predictor of sustained remission. It's no secret that a healthy spirit leads to a healthier body and mind. Studies have also correlated spiritual health with greater peace living with HIV and healthier lives in patients with asymptomatic heart failure. There are two places in medicine currently where a spiritually based model is the medical standard of care, and that is addiction treatment and end-of-life care. The first three steps of AA, which is a very powerful form of addiction treatment throughout our country, is number one, admitting that we are powerless over whatever we are trying to give up, alcohol, etc., and that our lives have become unmanageable. Two, coming to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. And three, making a decision to turn over our will and our lives to the care of a higher power, or however we understand that power. So 1, 2, and 3, the first three steps of AA are spiritually based. And then spiritual care, end-of-life care, is another place where spirituality is very present. On the other hand, it's also important to recognize that for many, their spiritual struggles could actually be the root of their mental health constructs. They can be angry at God, have religious guilt, feel punished and not understand why, feel abandoned by God, feel all sorts of projections that we would project onto ourselves, onto life, onto others. We can project onto a higher power as we believe that power. And this can exacerbate or even facilitate the development of psychiatric symptoms. The research on spirituality and suicide is particularly interesting. Research shows that belief and faith in God can be associated with significantly lower suicidality, even among those not aligned with any religion. Recognizing purpose and meaning in life can significantly predict a person's overall well-being. The studies referenced here by Dr. Tyler Vanderweel involved nearly 90,000 women who were followed for around 2 decades. It was found that those who attended religious services weekly were 5 times less likely to die from suicide compared to those who did not attend at all. A similar study of about 100,000 men and women who attended services weekly showed that weekly attendance predicted a 68% lower risk of deaths by despair. So this is deaths from suicide, drugs, alcohol among the females, and a 33% lower risk among the males. These are not isolated findings. A systematic review in 2016 located 89 studies on religion and suicide published in the preceding years. The authors concluded unequivocally that religious affiliation protected against suicide attempts with large effect sizes, even after controlling for social supports and access to mental health care. Certain aspects of spirituality and religion can even confer protection against suicidality for non-religious individuals. In one recent study, among participants with chronic mood disorders, belief and faith in God was associated with substantially lower suicidality, even among those who were religiously unaffiliated. So, what might account for this trend? What's going on? What's the mechanism of action here? First, the best known predictor of suicide is hopelessness. When people lose hope in a bright future, they're more prone to take their lives. Spirituality can help prevent suicidal behavior by promoting faith and hope. There have been studies showing that psychiatric patients with depression were significantly more likely to benefit from cognitive and dialectical behavioral therapy if they believed in God. So basically, it was found that belief in God predicted greater belief in treatment in general, and therefore greater hope that one will eventually get out of what they're feeling. This is very powerful as well. So essentially, faith in God facilitates the belief that things can improve, even when people are at a very low point. Another key predictor for suicide is impulsivity. A surprisingly high number of suicide attempts occur suddenly. One study found that more than 40% of attempts had manifested within 10 minutes of someone deciding to take their life. Religion can help prevent suicide by promoting higher order values and self-control, since religious beliefs and values tend to create a buffer against such spontaneous thoughts and urges. But the interesting thing with the studies before is they looked at all those mechanisms, but that actually wasn't the main mechanism. The main mechanism for why attendance of weekly services prevented suicidality was actually more so a moral prohibition against suicide as endorsed by the religious establishments that were attended. That was shown to be the number one factor that actually reduced suicidality, even though all the other factors came into play as well. So here are some spiritual mechanisms of action. And so, it's the question, what is it about religious and spiritual commitment that helps people? We talked about a few things, but there's so much more. The answer to this question is multifold. Being a member of a supportive religious or spiritual community provides consistent and positive human connection that eliminates one's feelings of shame and guilt. Religion and spirituality connect people to something greater than themselves, including a higher purpose. Healthy spiritual practices and beliefs may include messages about healthy living, life-affirming attitudes, and encouragement during difficult times. With respect to alcoholism, qualities that protected against alcohol dependence included an attitude of thankfulness or gratitude, social involvement in a community of like-minded individuals, a belief in the involvement of God or a higher power in one's life, and a belief in God as judge. Belief in a higher power can serve as a positive and secure attachment in one's life to compensate for a lack of other positive attachments. The way one views their relationship with God may also affect one's mental health and recovery. For instance, people who took a collaborative rather than a dependent religious coping style, basically working with God rather than waiting for God to fix things, showed greater improvement in their mental health and recovery. So now there is another concept called spiritual health. And as the ideas of mental health and spirituality are going mainstream, spiritual health is a term that's cropping up more and more often. Many people mistakenly use it as a synonym for spirituality, but it's actually quite different. Here Here are the qualities of what spiritual health is: thoughtful emotional reactions, even to life's greatest challenges, a healthy ability to feel and express emotions where appropriate, especially when dealing with grief or loss, daily practices to help people process hardships, changes, and emotions, an ability to deal with the challenges posed by other humans with kindness and understanding, flexible beliefs that can adjust to needs to new adjust as needed to new circumstances or information, mindfulness and presence when eating, exercising, working, enjoying time with loved ones, and the ability to explain one's inner state to others if necessary or desired. So in contrast to spirituality, spiritual health is something that you can cultivate and work towards. Spirituality can take a different form for everyone. Spiritual health can apply to any type of spirituality or religion. When spirituality is a source of potential that everyone can access if they wish, spiritual health is a spectrum on which everyone falls. Because of this, it's a little bit more concrete. So let's talk briefly about the effects of spirituality on health span and lifespan. And to do so, I'd like to bring in Dan Buettner's work with the Blue Zones. It began as a National Geographic exhibition that was led by Dan Buettner, and he identified all the places around the world where people were consistently living into their 100s and dubbed these places the Blue Zone. He chose 5 basic places, and then he sent in his team of demographers, scientists, anthropologists, who then distilled down everything about the lives of these people to better understand what was it about the foods, habits, mindsets, community of these people that enabled them to have greater health span and lifespan. Lifespan obviously is your longevity. Health span is what percentage of that you are living with good health. We all want to improve our longevity, of course, but not at the detriment of our health span. And so now, with respect to spirituality and mental health and their effects on your lifespan, first of all, the World Health Organization has shown that people with serious mental illness generally have a 10 to 25-year decrease in their life expectancy. Untreated mental illness can have long-term impacts on physical health. So obviously, treating mental illness will improve health span and lifespan. And of course, untreated mental illness also increases the likelihood of having unhealthy health habits and many other problems. Spirituality increases health span and lifespan first by reducing mental and physical illness, but also in its own right. And this is what was shown by the Blue Zones. So what was identified was 9 common factors. This is the Blue Zone's power of 9, where they had 9 things that all of these 5 communities of the centenarians had in common, and we'll look a little bit closer at them. One of them is that they moved naturally. They had natural movement. This is where people walked a lot and moved in these communities. 2, they knew their why. They were living with a sense of purpose. They knew how to decompress. These are their downshifts or their moments. They had this 80% rule. They stopped eating when they were 80% full. They had a plant slant, eating more of a plant-based diet. They had wine at 5. A lot of them had glasses of wine, which, we know that a little bit of wine is good for our health for many reasons, and also for the physical and mental benefit of relaxing. And then the right tribe, surrounding yourself with a healthy support circle, loved ones first, investing time in family. And then number 9 is being a member of a faith-based community. And so for each of these things, Dan Buettner and his team found how many years of life expectancy could potentially be added based on these. And research showed, so first of all there is 263 centenarians that were studied in Dan Buettner's work. And all but 5 of the 263 belonged to a faith community, and the denomination did not seem to matter with these results. But research showed that attending faith-based services 4 times per month added an average of 4 to 14 years of life expectancy to these people. So why should doctors inquire about patients' spiritual needs? Addressing spirituality enables doctors to serve the needs of patients as whole persons, and genuinely holistic healthcare must address the totality of a person's relational, existential, physical, psychological, social, and spiritual needs. These studies suggest that physicians and healers can enhance their effectiveness by considering inquiring about and attending to the spiritual needs of their patients. In the studies referenced, while only 10% of psychiatrists believe spirituality to be important in their practices, 65% of patients with depression, anxiety, and other psychiatric conditions wanted spirituality to play a part in their treatment. And for medical inpatients, 77% said physicians should take patients' spiritual needs into consideration, and 37% wanted physicians to address religious beliefs more frequently. A large survey of cancer outpatients in New York City found that over 50% felt it was appropriate for physicians to inquire about their religious beliefs and spiritual needs. However, it only occurred 1% of the time. So there is a big delta between what patients are wanting and what is presently being done. So the first part of the talk made an argument for why spirituality is important for improving mental health and well-being. Now I'd like to shift to spirituality and the science of spirituality and reconciling the seeming paradox of the science of spirituality. Like we talked about before, science is seeking for that which is reproducible, quantifiable, easy to study through double-blind controlled trials. Spirituality, in contrast, is something that is much more transcendent, subjective, immanent, difficult to quantify and reproduce precisely because of its nature, which is why the science of spirituality is such a paradox. And my work here has involved reconciling or attempting to these seeming paradoxes. And the first way in which I started to do this was when I started my psychiatry training. Psychiatry, the word psyche could be translated as either mind or soul. I was a doctor of the soul, right? I was studying to be a doctor of the soul. But what was most interesting to me was that the word soul was never used in any of my training at Stanford, at Yale, at NYU. Soul really wasn't considered to be a part of psychiatry. And so one of the questions I had is, what is this strange thing called soul, and how is it even relevant to our treatment? And my work has been really exploring that idea and trying to understand how other people understand the soul in healing. My work actually took me around the world to understand the soul, to ashrams in India, learning Buddhist meditation in Thailand, working with different shamans in South America and South Africa, ultimately coming to study Kabbalah in New York City, and really trying to understand what is this soul and how does it relate to healing? And I asked many, many questions. What is the soul? My favorite answer to the question of what is the soul came from a Mexican shaman named Fernando Broca. And he described the soul as being comprised of two parts. First is there's the part of our soul that is interconnected to everybody and everything. This is what people say when we're one unified soul. The second part of the soul is that which encapsulates our own uniqueness. So your own set of unique talents, skills, abilities, purpose, mission, why you came into this world and how you can make your unique contribution. So the soul is this two-part system which at once encompasses our uniqueness and our interconnectedness with everybody else. And intuition is a very interesting subject, which I'm going to dive into next for the second part of the talk. And the reason that I bring intuition up with the soul is because I feel tapping into your intuition is often a way of accessing your soul. Intuition is the language of the soul. So this is the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. And this is where a very famous ancient Greek aphorism, know thyself, is inscribed. The phrase was later expounded upon by Socrates, who taught that the unexamined life is not worth living. The ancient Greeks greatly valued the power inherent in self-knowledge and looking within for truth. So what is intuition? The word intuition comes from the Latin intuere, which means knowledge from within. Whether you call it a gut feeling, an inner voice, or a sixth sense, a well-developed intuition is becoming increasingly touted as a superpower. Intuition can provide us with the answers to the most important questions in our lives. It's that inner voice that can break through to show us the right way when we're about to make the wrong decision. Using our intuition allows us to access wisdom about our lives that we may not have been completely aware that we possessed. This knowledge can only be revealed by looking within. And here is some other definitions of intuition: a hunch or a gut feeling, the ability to acquire knowledge without proof, evidence, or conscious reasoning, knowing something without necessarily knowing exactly how we knew it, direct access to the unconscious, a sense of calling or overpowering certainty about something, an awareness of a knowledge that's just at the threshold of conscious perception. So, intuition is a very interesting thing. How do you tap into your intuition? There are many voices in our head. There's the voice of reason, there's the voice of emotion, and then there is the voice of intuition, which is often that still, quiet voice that can only be heard when the shouting of our thoughts and the shouting of our emotions temporarily ceases. And here are some synonyms for intuition. There's extrasensory perception, the soul's whisper, clairvoyance, precognition, second sight, a gut feeling, a sixth sense, divination, telepathy, instinct. So we see that some of these words are in the woo-woo category a little bit, and other ones have more of a scientific basis to them. So there's three types of intuition that I'd like to talk to you about today. The first type is often referred to as implicit knowledge or learning, which in essence refers to knowledge we acquired in the past and either forgot or did not realize we ever learned. In Thinking Fast and Slow, behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, describes the cognitive errors we often make as human beings, believing we're using logic, the deliberate slow thinking system, whereas in fact, we're using the other system, our type 1 intuition, the fast emotional pattern recognition system he calls instinct. In other words, we think that we often act on instinct, but we justify it to ourselves using our logical, rational mind. It's called retrospective rationalizations. We as human beings are masters of retrospective rationalization. That's type 1 intuition. Type 2 intuition is more of focused on subtle energy, and it's the ability of our nervous system to detect and respond to environmental signals such as electromagnetic fields, examples of which are staring, human communication, beyond one's perception, capacity for empathy, being in flow, heart-focused living. We can all agree that when we're sitting with a patient, there's a great deal of nonverbal communication going on. This entails their body language, attire, movement, gestures, eye contact, and how they communicate and take up space in a room. There's some research supporting the perspective that a subtle yet influential energetic or electromagnetic communication system is operating. The Hindu mystics call this energy Shakti. Chinese medical practitioners call it Qi. This energy operates just below our conscious level of awareness, and we can experience it as a type of intuition that is likely an aspect of empathy or our interconnectedness with one another. These ideas are growing in popularity in Western medicine, and there's even a new subspecialty that's emerging called energy medicine. Research suggests that the heart is the most powerful biological oscillator within the body, with an electromagnetic field that's at least 5,000 times greater than that produced by the brain. Many people think that the brain rules the heart, but it actually may be the other way around. Because the heart has the most powerful resonance, the rest of the body systems can be pulled into entrainment with it. At moments when we enter a flow state or feel in harmony with something else, a glorious sunset, inspiring music, another human being, we are coming into sync with ourselves. Not only are we more relaxed and at peace at such moments, but the entrained state sustains our ability to perform well and offers numerous health benefits. People who develop their ability to maintain entrainment by sustaining sincere, heart-focused states such as appreciation and love, are actually able to cultivate this and use this to improve their overall mental health and well-being. And people can cultivate these sorts of practices through disciplines like regular meditation. Research indicates that the energetic information contained in our heart's field isn't just detected by ourselves and our own brains and bodies, but can actually also be registered by the people around us, which is how we can connect with or resonate with people on an energetic level. And this often occurs outside of our conscious awareness. And the third type of intuition is non-local intuition. This is the knowledge or sense of something that cannot be explained by past or forgotten knowledge or environmental signals. So this is when a mother knows something's happening to her child a million miles away, or twins who could be separated by a great distance but still are able to feel each other, or individuals who may have psychic abilities. This is non-local intuition. Non-local intuition is often interchangeable with processes categorized as psi phenomena, such as telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition. These concepts are fraught with debate in the scientific community, and theories postulating how they work have yet to be confirmed, and an integrated theory remains to be formulated. Nevertheless, there is increasing research evidence based on an examination of physiological responses that suggests that non-local intuition may be a real and measurable phenomenon. So now I'm going to share some cases from my own practice with you where I've experienced some examples of some of these things. Now, this is the case of Hans the violinist. At the time that what I'm going to describe to you occurred, I had been working with Hans for several years. Hans was a brilliant violinist, but plagued with a deep depression. And I, at one point, had gone on a trip to the Ukraine many years ago. And I woke up in the middle of the night on this trip feeling that something was terribly wrong. I felt all this anxiety and panic and felt like I was having a midnight panic attack. Never having experienced something like that, but having had many patients who experienced it, I thought, something, there must be something is off. I checked my email, and one moment prior, my patient Hans had written me that he was feeling suicidal. By virtue of having received that email in real time, I was able to work with Hans, call him right away, and literally and metaphorically talk him off the ledge. Had I not called, maybe he would have still been completely okay, but we don't know. But the very fact that that happened, here I was 5,000 miles and 7 time zones away, receiving a communication from my patient in this way that woke me up from sleep and compelled me to then check my email, was so important and so meaningful to both myself and to Hans. Sigmund Freud described experiences like this as thought transference, mental processes in one person, ideas, emotional states, impulses that can be transferred to another person through empty space without employing the familiar methods of communication by means of words or signs. So I'm going to talk to you about another case like this. So this is a priest that I was seeing in my practice, also many years prior. And the time that I'm going to be describing this situation was 6 months into our treatment. And so Mark, the priest, comes in and we start talking. And at some point in our discussion that day, Mark says to me, coming to therapy is really difficult and sometimes exhausting. I feel as though I'm working really hard and I just leave here absolutely drained. And I respond to Mark something akin to the following phrase, saying, Mark, I could understand how you might want therapy to feel like a massage where you're all relaxed and are able to leave light. But sometimes the very fact that you feel drained is evidence of how hard you're working and how much you're releasing. So it could actually be a very positive thing. Now, that response is a fine response with one exception. As soon as the words about the massage left my lips, I almost wanted to grab them back. And I thought, why in the world am I saying something about a massage or making an analogy to a massage to a priest? It just was a very strange thing. And it's nothing, if I had deliberately planned to have a response, it's not a response I ever would have deliberately said. And yet the words left my lips. And as soon as they left my lips, I saw the expression on Mark's face change. And he says to me, "That's so strange that you mentioned this massage because I felt so much shame and guilt about this, and I've been wanting to talk to you about this." And then Mark proceeded to tell me how he had actually been going to massage parlors and had all of this shame and guilt. And it was this unconscious slip that I happened to say unexpectedly that actually opened that up for Mark. And it ended up resulting in a really powerful and catalytic opening in the treatment. Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer was a psychologist who studied these kinds of phenomena and wrote them in a beautiful book called Extraordinary Knowing: Science, Skepticism, and the Inexplicable Powers of the Human Mind. And one of her quotes was, "We cannot reach these new sources of information simply by tuning in to something new. Paradoxically, we must also tune out much of the ordinary information that continually bombards our senses." So this is my colleague and friend, Janine DePayer, who's a psychoanalyst in New York City, and wrote a beautiful review article called Uncanny Communication and the Porous Mind. And this is a compilation of experiences similar to those that I just shared with you, as shared in the medical and psychodynamic literature by many, many analysts over the last 50 years. And there's a whole slew of individuals reporting these kinds of experiences with their patients and writing them up in beautiful case studies. Janine herself had such an experience, which she also shared in this paper. And so, what is going on? And how do we understand these processes that are happening outside of our conscious awareness, which are enabling us either to pick up something in a non-local way many miles away from a patient, or to be able to tune in even within a room with a patient and have an unconscious slip that then creates an opening in the treatment, something that you would never, ever deliberately say that leaves your mouth. That actually, if you go to Janine's article, she had a similar experience that she describes. I'm not going to go into it here, but you'll get a copy of all these slides. And if you want, you could read her article. So there's a number of thinkers are thinking about ways in which we tune in this way. And within the psychoanalytic space, there is this idea of regression and psychoanalytic tradition specifically for tuning in. This is the free association of Freud lying on the couch. Ferenczi talked about the dialogue of the unconsciouses, that I'm talking to you and you're talking to me, but at the same time, my unconscious is talking to your unconscious and your unconscious is talking to my unconscious. There's something happening that's much, much deeper than what's being said. And then Bion talked about the unknown and unknowable. Searles talked about the dissolution of boundaries. Bromberg talked about the twilight space where the impossible becomes possible. Stern described it as unformulated experience. Boyes talked about it as unthought unknown. And Farrow talked about it as waking dream thought. So essentially, a number of psychoanalytic thinkers have developed and individualized methods for tuning in to nonverbal unconscious material through a cultivation of shared trance-like hypnagogic state, which can be thought of as a form of telepathic attunement. So recent advances highlight the way in which the analyst's bodies and our five senses are actually vehicles for the acute attunement to precisely these kinds of communications. And Peter Levine's work with somatic experiencing is one of the spaces where this is elaborated upon. All of these methods ultimately entail actively tuning into unconscious material beyond words, whether somatically or imaginatively, and listening with a different ear. or shifting your attention from the latent to the virtual. This method of attunement parallels in many ways that of telepathy or thought transference as described by Freud, which is the sensing of subtle energies and non-local intuition. And so what's the neurobiological basis of all this? What do we know about what actually happens in the brain when these kinds of unconscious processes are triggered? Neurobiologists are continuing to search for logical explanations to explain exceptional experiences like this, such as the brainstem awakening the thalamus and the cortex. But these experiences challenge accepted models of the mind. Although neurobiological constructs elegantly describe unconscious communication between two people in the same locality, telepathic communication defies these systems when the two brains are connecting across time and space. So there's also been studies on what increases people's capacity to have these experiences. Who is more telepathic? Who experiences these intuitive, interesting experiences, whether with patients, with friends, etc., more often? And it's been found that individuals who have an increased capacity for this, number one, believe it's a real thing. They're usually more artistic and creative. They have a history of experiences like this. They're more likely to meditate. They're open to the unknown, and they're usually more emotionally receptive. Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the concept of synchronicity. So synchronicity is a term that was coined by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. He uses it to describe a meaningful coincidence or the co-occurrence of two things that are related but not causally, such as you think about somebody and then they call you. My thinking about that person didn't lead to them calling me, most likely, but somehow or another, I may associate those two things in my mind as meaningful, and therefore it's a synchronicity. Or you have a dream about someone you haven't heard from in ages, and you bump into them on the street the next day. My having a dream about that person didn't lead me to bump into them, and yet that co-occurrence of these two events makes it a synchronicity. So Carl Jung has some amazing stories about synchronicity that he has shared. And Carl Jung and Freud together have some stories like that. So I'm going to share two such stories with you. So one was Carl Jung was talking to a patient of his who was blocking her own progress through a wall of logic. This patient starts to describe a golden scarab beetle in her dream. And just as that happens, Carl Jung opens his window, sees a gold scarab beetle fly by, puts it in his hand, and presents it to the patient, basically saying, here is your golden scarab. This beautifully illogical moment resulted in a breakthrough for this woman who had been blocking her own progress through all her logic. Even though the synchronicity was a reflection of Jung's patient's inner landscape, it was simultaneously a synchronistic reflection of a deeper process taking place within Jung. For Jung to be hearing a patient's dream of a golden scarab and to have the golden scarab fly into his office was an externalized, synchronistic reflection of an important process that was happening inside of him. It is noteworthy that a synchronistic event can collectively reflect and be mutually shared by more than one person in both similar and similarly unique ways. For Jung and his patient, the shared synchronistic event was a living experience of being connected to something greater than themselves. A skeptic would argue that this is merely a coincidence, with no inherent meaning aside from that ascribed to it by Jung and his patient. In their search for meaning, Jung and his patient created a magical message of a meaning by combining a series of random events. Jung would say that what made this a synchronicity was not the co-occurrence of these events, but precisely the subjective meaning ascribed to this co-occurrence. The relatives of the golden scarab beetle were no doubt arriving at windows all over town and not setting off emotional breakthroughs in anybody else. It's not the objective events themselves, but what we make of them that counts. Another really powerful synchronicity occurred between Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. So Jung was 25 years Freud's junior and was being groomed by Freud to take over the psychoanalytic society that Freud founded. Despite Jung's spiritual learnings, Freud very strongly dissuaded Jung from publicly sharing his spiritual interests and theories for fear that their subjective, unscientific nature would undermine the field of psychoanalysis. As Freud and Jung sat together describing this matter, Jung understandably felt patronized, angry, misunderstood by Freud. Suddenly, Freud and Jung heard a loud creak from out of nowhere, to which Jung replied, "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Moreover, it's going to happen again." Then suddenly another creak occurred from out of nowhere, startling both Freud and Jung. It was after this peculiar occurrence that Freud decided to withhold the leadership of the title he was planning to give Jung. This led Jung to feel abandoned and confused and foreshadowed his nervous breakdown, during which time he wrote his famous The Red Book, an opportunity for him to individuate from Freud by integrating psychoanalytic tenets and the principles of spirituality. The scientists and Freud, however, had to understand what was causing the unexpected and mysterious noise in this library. So Freud decided to sit there until the noise occurred again, at which time he deduced that the heat in the library was drying out the oak bookshelves and causing them to creak. The coinciding of this fairly normal mechanical phenomena with the precise moment or two of Freud and Jung's disagreement is precisely what turned this coincidence into a meaningful synchronicity. From this perspective, there is nothing mystical or divine about the origin of synchronicity, although it nevertheless affirms a wondrous appreciation for the creative capacities of each person to order his or her internal and external worlds. So I'm going to talk to you now about two cases from my own practice or synchronicities that happen to occur around the concept of bereavement. So in the first case, I, a long time ago also, started treating a young man whose girlfriend had just committed suicide. He was completely beside himself with grief, and it was very, very difficult for him to move forward. So at one point, we started talking about the potential of the woman who had just passed and whether she could still be with us in some way. And then a very interesting thing occurred. Right as we began this discussion, the little buzzer that I have that I would use to buzz patients into my office fell off my wall. The interesting thing is my buzzer had never fallen off my wall before that or since. And so is this a random coincidence? I asked my patient when this happened, because he was also startled by it, what he made of that. And what he made of that was that perhaps this was his girlfriend actually communicating with us in some way. And, we talked about the potential possible meaning of that. And for the patient, this was actually a very, very powerful catalytic moment, because it meant that she was still with him in some way, that she was still there, that she was hearing him and responding to his distress and giving him a sign that she was okay. That was the meaning that he created of this. So we started talking about this, the buzzer fell, and then he created this meaning. So this for him was a very powerful catalytic synchronicity. I've had other synchronicities like this with other patients. I had a young woman who was one of 4 sisters, and one of the sisters ended up dying in a motor vehicle accident. And she came and would talk to me about her sister. And a very odd thing would happen when she would start to talk to me about her sister. And that is that the lights in my room would start flashing. This happened multiple times, startling both her and myself. And the same thing happened. I asked her, "What do you make of this happening?" And both of us were curious, because the fact that it would happen repeatedly, is she here with us? Is she communicating with us? Something about the very occurrence of that we were experiencing that together and that we were making meaning of that occurrence in that way was also a very powerful and positive thing for the patient to be able to move forward. With this particular patient, very interestingly, on one of the days that this happened, when the lights would flash in my room, It probably happened about 6 or 7 times over the course of our treatment. So this was a repetitive visitation that we would get, or as we interpreted it. One of those times, my patient went back home, and she had the same thing happen at her home, where she turned on the vacuum, and the vacuum started turning on and off, on and off, on and off, in the same way that the lights that day had turned on and off, on and off, on and off. So it was a very interesting and unusual experience for both of us. And it was an opportunity for powerful meaning making for myself and my patient. Okay. So we talked a little bit about spirituality. We talked about intuition. I want to talk about some of the dangers of spirituality and some forms of toxic spirituality, which are also very important. So you have people entering a lot of different new age and not so new age spiritual groups and belief systems, sometimes cults, etc. And sometimes people will come with certain beliefs, some of which could be really helpful or perhaps very helpful in moderation. But sometimes those very beliefs could also be quite undermining. So this is a list of 6 beliefs that are new age spiritual beliefs that, on one hand, to some degree, could be helpful. And on the other hand, if taken to an extreme, could actually be quite destructive. And I want to go through each of these with you. Number one is that we are 100% responsible for our circumstances. So this is part of some of the, you are the master of your destiny. It's about your thoughts and your intentionality and your actions. And on one hand, it feels great to live an empowered life and feel that you have control over your life. We should all have that belief to some degree, but we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a society that grants different people different levels of power and privilege. Believing that all humans are equal and equally able to change their lives, therefore, does not unfortunately create a world where that's the case. Instead, what it does is it ignores very real systems of oppression and denies the victims of those systems validation and empathy. Spiritual and self-development leaders who focus only on individual responsibility can do so because it's easy. Acknowledging our history and circumstances is a longer and messier process. Number 2, that the ego is the enemy and needs to be eliminated. So in my work, I've seen the term ego rise as a catch-all phrase for a spectrum of defense mechanisms, emotions, felt experiences, and unmet human needs. In this context, ego is something that needs to be conquered, which means by extension that all those feelings and needs are potential failings, roadblocks on the path to a more enlightened self. You are encouraged to pit one part of yourself, your ego, against the other part, whether your soul, your non-ego, which could be harmful and futile. A more compassionate way, rather than pitting one part against another of yourself and therefore having one part overpower another, is actually creating space for an understanding and validating all the different parts of yourself and learning how they can work in unison. Number 3, that reacting with anger is a sign that you need to do more work. And sure, we certainly don't want clients or patients or family or friends who are going to be, raging and tyrannical and having uncontrolled anger. And yet, feeling anger is not harmful. Neither is sharing that we feel it. It may sometimes make us feel uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. And what's most important is to be curious about our anger. And anger, especially in the face of injustice, can unlock empathy and important concerted actions. Anger also can lead you to set healthy boundaries. Number 4, meditation is a purely beneficial experience. There's no denying the benefits of meditation. I'm a huge proponent, but it's important to acknowledge that it doesn't work for everybody and in some cases can actually cause distress. For example, asking people who have had extreme trauma to pay close, sustained attention to their internal experience may thrust them into emotional arousals and flashbacks, and that could actually be quite undermining. Number 5, the law of attraction: control your thoughts, manifest your reality. There's no doubt that positive thinking can feel empowering. Visualizing one's goals and becoming more conscious about working towards them is a positive thing for sure. But it's also important to realize that control of your thoughts is not everything. And you also want to accept and honor whatever thoughts come up. You don't want to be living in this so-called toxic positivity mindset where you're constantly positive about everything as a way of repressing certain emotions and important experiences that are as important to your being a whole person as are, the positive feelings. Number 6, rising above our emotions is a sign of spiritual maturity. We don't have to deny any parts of ourselves to be more spiritual, and we don't have to blame ourselves for being human. In fact, embracing our spirituality means embracing our humanity with all of its messy complexity. So then there is this idea of spiritual bypassing. And I love this quote where spiritual bypassing is the practice of denying and suppressing the darkness within you and plastering it with a sparkly feel-good Band-Aid. This is a little bit like the toxic positivity, or when you have a difficult emotion come up that you're uncomfortable feeling, you don't want to feel, you replace it immediately with a philosophy or a mantra or an affirmation. And incidentally, those kinds of processes could be very helpful as a means of controlling one's emotions. However, to do so consistently and without the acknowledgement of the underlying emotion could actually only perpetuate that which your body, mind, and spirit is trying to process and metabolize. And because of certain beliefs about appropriateness of certain affects, etc., it's unable to come up. So spiritual bypassing is essentially the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. The term was introduced in the early 1980s by John Welwood, a Buddhist teacher and psychotherapist who passed away not long ago. Now let's talk a little bit about religious and spiritual cults. This is very important. And maybe many of you have treated individuals who have been members of cults. I certainly have. Cult leaders often will make promises that are very unattainable, but also not offered by other groups in society, like total financial security, total health, constant peace of mind, and eternal life. Human beings on some level want these things at a very deep level. And certain kinds of people are very drawn to this and therefore may join these cults. Many join cults because they believe that they're being offered solid, absolute answers to questions of good and evil, religion, politics, the meaning of life, etc. The messages are usually simple and seem to make sense, often the opposite of what's provided in typical everyday life, which is much more messy and complex. A common feature of those recruited to cults is low self-esteem, where the cults prey on you by love bombing you, or as soon as you join the cult, surrounding you with love and acceptance in order for you to feel that you want to be a member. People who join cults are often waiting to be rescued in some way. Women are 70% more likely than men to join cults. According to Tufts psychoanalyst Dr. Stanley Kath, who treated 60 former cult members in the course of his career, many people who join cults have experienced religion at some points in their life and rejected it. Many are intelligent young people from sheltered environments. Many have histories of failing to achieve intimacy, blaming others for their failures, and constantly striving for perfectionistic goals. These qualities make these young people prime candidates for cult recruitment. Cults often promote an us versus them mentality, convincing followers that they are somehow superior than non-followers. The us versus them mentality can lead cult members to isolate themselves from their families and replace those relationships with new ones inside the cult. Cult leaders are masters often of mind control, convincing victims to separate themselves from society, give up large sums of money, buy whatever they're promoting, literally and figuratively. Ways to do this have included public humiliation, self-incrimination, brainwashing, and inducing paranoia. Cult members often have no idea that they're in a cult and can spend years overcoming the emotional damage incurred during this time. So another form of toxic spirituality is an excessive dependence on psychics and astrologers. I've certainly had some clients like this. An addiction to psychics is actually an addiction to control. Wanting somebody to have omnipotent control over your future by having somebody else supposedly peek in at it into the future and be able to quell your fears and worries and advise you as to the right course of action to find joy and avoid calamity. Patients with psychic addictions are often deeply insecure, highly perfectionistic, thereby thinking that somebody else, a so-called expert to whom they can fork over some money, has more insight into their life and their future than they do, and therefore is better able than they are to advise them as to the best course of action. People who are addicted to psychics often cannot tolerate uncertainty and therefore will willingly give over their power to others out of fear. So then there's also OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, specifically around spirituality. And this is also known as scrupulosity. So individuals who suffer from religious OCD or scrupulosity generally have very strict moral, ethical, and religious standards. They feel easily condemned by what others may consider the simplest standards, simplest standards or guidelines to religion if they deviate. And I've had a lot of conversations with rabbis because, or even priests, that there's certain religious rules that people follow, and sometimes people can go a little bit too much, and it starts to control their life in ways that are undermining, and rather than enabling them to feel free by the laws that they are abiding by, the laws start to make them feel very encumbered in their life and in their mind. In addition to extreme guilt feelings or feeling unholy or unclean, a person with religious OCD will often experience symptoms of anxiety and depression, which can be traced back to their fear of eternal damnation, or they're somehow not okay at the core. A person with religious OCD will have an overwhelming urge to engage in any compulsive behavior that may lead to forgiveness or will restore good religious standing. And some examples of religious obsessions include fear of living in sin, fear of going to hell, fear of committing immoral or sinful behaviors, fear of not praying humbly enough or sincerely, fear of having blasphemous thoughts, fear of not having enough faith, a lot of things like that. Religious delusions detrimentally affect help-seeking treatment and outcome. Evidence suggests that those with religious delusions and hallucinations take longer to establish service contracts, receive more medications, have higher overall symptom scores on measures of psychosis and of poor functioning. They're more likely to receive magical or religious healing, be not satisfied with psychiatric treatment, and not to adhere to psychiatric medication. Evidence also suggests that those with religious delusions have poor outcome and will more frequently indulge in violence or self-harm. So we talked about a number of different things, and I want to, before I summarize a talk, to end with this new paradigm. This is a quote by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. What if we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, but spiritual beings having this temporary human experience? It's a very interesting quote. It kind of turns things on its head a little bit. I like this quote because well, we'll talk a little bit more. I'll talk more about this, but first we'll go to the summary. So in summary, while spirituality and psychiatry were strange bedfellows in the days of Freud, there's growing scientific evidence suggesting that spirituality and religion may reduce mental and physical illness while increasing mental and physical well-being, health span, and lifespan. Intuition, of which there are three primary types, is a powerful bridge between science and spirituality, which may operate on various levels of awareness and influence therapeutic dynamics. When appropriate, topics like spirituality, intuition, and synchronicity can be effectively integrated into clinical treatment and provide a unique lens into a client's inner world. It's important to understand spiritually informed complexities within the therapeutic setting, from unconscious communication and thought transference, the potential pitfalls of toxic spirituality, psychic addiction, and religious OCD, to name a few. Thank you very much for listening. I now welcome your questions.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Houston. That was wonderfully, wonderfully informative. We did get quite a few questions, so I want to get to them. First, I just want to ask a very basic question, that we have a lot of people who are clinicians on the grand rounds right now. And two questions. How do we take apart our own beliefs to meet somebody where theirs are? Because, human beings, we're all at different places. And many clinicians fail to address this subject because it's going to the scary thing of where we might be in our own lives today. So how do we, drop our own beliefs and be very present to someone else's?
That's a beautiful question, Cheryl. Thank you so much for asking that. I feel that this is something that we're working with our patients and with ourselves on at all times, right? We are always seeking to understand our patients on their terms and meeting them where they're at. And that process that you are describing, the need to be able to disengage from ourselves to be as objective as we can in the service of our patients, is a continual process and something that we work to essentially purify and become better at with time. What comes up in us by virtue of what our patients say and do is our own countertransferential reactions, which are very important and powerful parts of the treatment and can be used as such in the care of our patients. So I think that it's a twofold answer. One is that we work on becoming, progressively more pure and, objective in that. And then we also use what comes up and our own experiences in the countertransference to be able to better understand what's going on in the dynamic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a good question on fear. Sometimes the fear of going to a place of eternal damnation is a helpful protective factor to avoid suicide and a way to deal with the hopelessness that often precedes it. How do we encourage a balance with that fear?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I showed the slides before on suicidality and spirituality, and how suicidality, whether or not there's belief in God, so basically that individuals who go to services of some sort, whether they believe in God or not, is associated with decrease in spirituality, in suicidality. And the reason for that, the number one reason, was the moral prohibition against suicide. And so, indeed, I think that for some people, they could feel very depressed, and their reason for not committing suicide will be fear-based, or fear of eternal damnation, or fear that they have to come back and do this again, or all sorts of other beliefs that we have in our culture and religious establishment with respect to suicide. And if indeed a person is on the brink of committing suicide, thank goodness that they have that fear to cling on to. Thank goodness that that is something that is keeping them alive, and hopefully will do so long enough for them to be able to expand their perspective, to heal, to start to feel better, to start to gain more hope, for something to be able to change, so that the fear is not the only thing keeping them alive. If fear is the thing keeping them alive now, wonderful, like great. There is something keeping them alive. And then we as clinicians have to work and meet them where they're at and try to replace their fear with a positive and more constructive optimism about how to live their life and to bring hope back into their life.
Great. Thank you so much. I have a longer question here, and I'm going to read the whole thing, so stay with me because I tried to shorten it and I couldn't. So this is from Jonah. My sense as to why a science of spirituality seems paradoxical is that science and spirituality operate from different and incompatible implicit assumptions about the nature of reality. We need a shared ontological framework that can account for everything from quantum physics, biology, psychology, cultural studies, etc., all the way to the synchronicities and mystical experiences like the pure consciousness event you mentioned in the talk. We need to naturalize the sacred and make the sacred natural. Do you know of any such frameworks concerning the structure of reality that do this? What theorists would you recommend that do this sort of work?
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful question. I think that that's absolutely right. And they are based on different ontological frameworks. And this is why we have this dichotomy and this seeming paradox. And it's also why it's so interesting to reconcile precisely this. And this is creating such a framework is at the like one of my goals in the creation of this mental health and spirituality center, which will be a bridge between Yale Divinity School and the Yale Medical School. So being able to find the common ground. There are individuals, there's physicians doing this, there's physicians doing it at the clinical level. There is a number of quantum theorists doing this. It's very interesting. There's this meditation teacher named Joe Dispenza, and he has a number of researchers at University of San Diego, including Dr. Hemal Patel, that runs his research program, where they are trying to create precisely this, a sort of framework to understand ontologically how these things come together. And I think it is, as you wrote, at the intersection of psychology, quantum physics, cultural studies, anthropology, religion, where all of this connects. And that's why it's so important that we have such siloed understandings of our world and the knowledge systems within it. So what we need now is the interconnectedness of that and having people start to talk to each other and share methods and then do research together and take things to the next level. Another person I would also, whose work I feel is also trying to move this forward as a physician, is Dr. Alyssa Rankin. She wrote a book called Sacred Medicine. She wrote a book, Mind Over Medicine. She's also looking for all the science to explain sacred spiritual experiences of this nature.
Here's a question from Lynette. I'm curious to hear about how you support patients who have psychic or healing abilities and feel very misunderstood or have been abandoned by loved ones because of their abilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So how do you support individuals with psychic or healing abilities? So often these individuals are what we can call an empath or a highly sensitive person. And so I'll answer that, and then I'll answer that specifically in response to if they feel misunderstood, abandoned by loved ones because of their abilities. So empaths and highly sensitive people, we talked about in the presentation, telepathy, thought transference, ways of interconnectedness and sort of intuitive capacities that certain people have. And there are some people that are, because of how they're born, because of how they're genetically, or because they have a lineage, they've had, their grandmother was a psychic and somebody was a rabbi healer, and, they have all of these lineages. They come into this world with abilities. And so Judith Orloff at UCLA has published many books, including like on the empathic capacity. She's a psychiatrist. She's published many books on the psychic or intuitive capacities that individuals have as empaths. And the other synonym for an empath is a highly sensitive person, an HSP. So individuals who can take on more from their environment than the majority of us. They can be with a patient and just be particularly intuitive. They will know. And most of you, if you think about it, certain people like this who are just a little bit more intuitive than the rest. And that intuition could be a wonderful thing in the psychiatric space, being a clinician and healer, but it could also be very difficult if you're picking up so much information from the world around you that it could be overwhelming to yourself and your own functioning. And, it could also be you can receive information. Like I've had numerous patients come to me with these sorts of abilities, some of which have capacities for precognition. So they know when things are going to happen. And when they were little, they would tell their parents, and their parents would be very scared when indeed those things would happen. And so they would be told, please don't do that. Please don't say things like this again. This is not a capacity that is often encouraged to be developed because it challenges our models of the mind and it creates discomfort for a lot of people. And so I think in working with these patients, I would, number one, validate the importance of their ability and their the importance of, number one, cultivating the ability to the degree that they want, and number two, creating powerful shielding and grounding practices so they can also turn off that ability. Sometimes too much of that ability could be overwhelming. And number two, three, I would refer them to communities where there are others and refer them to the work of Judith Orloff, and she's written extensively on this topic.
Good. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to try and synthesize a question into a more direct question. So how do we walk the fine line between supporting people where they are spiritually and not encouraging magical thinking?
Yeah, great question. Exactly. And I think, that's a question of, because some people would ask me, should we have all spirit patients cultivate spirituality? Absolutely not. I think it's always about meeting people where they're at and first understanding what is their current landscape. How important is spirituality? What do they want to develop? Why do they want to develop spirituality? Taking a full spiritual history. In what kind of spiritual tradition were they raised? How did that play out in their life? What are their spiritual and or religious beliefs now? How does that interact with their identity, with their healing journey? What are they seeking to get from this? And in understanding that, we also gauge to what degree is their spirituality adaptive and to what degree is it maladaptive? Does it lend itself to excessive magical thinking? And to what degree, is it actually undermining their capacity to succeed in life? I feel that the development of spirituality sometimes for certain people could increase magical thinking, and sometimes it actually could, be a very positive, constructive thing that will have nothing to do with magical thinking. So I think that it's really meeting people where they're at, and yeah, and just understanding them on their own terms. Thank you for that question. I like that question.
We have another good question here, and you may be setting up another grand rounds if I ask this, but do you see promise in the expansion of future psychedelic therapy practices for individual and communal spiritual health?
Okay, that's a great question. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about psychedelics for a second. So what are psychedelics? We all know what psychedelics are, but the reason I think psychedelics are so important and also so relevant to this talk, I didn't actually include them, but I figured someone might ask about them, is because not only do psychedelics offer a novel biological mechanism to treat some of the most difficult to treat conditions within psychiatry, including treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, addictions, but they also, for certain people, offer a connection to spirit. They can offer for people subjective, self-transcendent, sometimes mystical experiences that change the way people see their lives in the world. It essentially interrupts and expands an individual's narrative of their life, and they are able to leave the experience transformed. That's one of the mechanisms of action. So at Yale, currently there's a number of psychedelic researchers and a lot of psychedelic research being done. At the center that we're going to be starting with Dr. Pittenger at Yale, we're going to also be expanding it to include the spiritual side of psychedelic use. So studying these self-transcendent mystical experiences that arise, in addition to studying the neurobiology, which already is very prominent. And I think that for a lot of people who are looking for something greater and who might be looking for it because of a condition like facing a terminal illness or a depression or feeling stuck in their life, or not having any of that, but really feeling that experience could be an expansive, powerful, consciousness expanding phenomena for them that can move them forward. Psychedelics could be very powerful catalysts for that. But I think the most important thing is that at this point, we focus on the evidence base and create the safety around their use and have more research that we know exactly what is safe and have more of a template through which we can take our patients.
This has been an absolutely amazing grand rounds where I have more questions that came in at the end that we can't possibly get to. Thank you so much for your presentation, for your time, for your insight. A lot of the comments are, this is so valuable. We are not seeing enough of this. So is there a way that people can reach out to you with additional questions should they have them? That's how we will end, because
Absolutely.
we have a hard stop in
Absolutely.
1 minute.
Absolutely. My website is annayusum.com, and my website, or my email is anna.usim@yale.edu. So
And we are literally at time. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you for all the questions. I think this is the beginning of a really valuable discussion that we're having here at Silver Hill
thank you,
and elsewhere.
everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Yusuf.
Mm-hmm. Bye-bye.